Hello, everybody. Welcome to another DTx webinar. Okay, let's get started. So today's session is research, regulatory, and reimbursement considerations for DTx. Our speakers are Benjamin Alouf and Acacia Parks, and today's webinar is from 12 to 1 p.m. This is a free educational event brought to you by Louisiana Department of Health, Office of Behavioral Health, Northeast Delta Human Services Authority, and Foundation for Wellness. It is accredited for 1 hour for AMA PRI Category 1 credits, LPC, Social Work General, and nurses as well. Full participation of this presentation is required to receive credit, and we monitor throughout the session. In 1 week, you will receive an email from Foundation for Wellness with instructions on how to get your certificates. Again, as a reminder, if you dialed in by phone using the audio, please email info@Foundation for Wellness. And in that email, the phone number you dialed in with, along as your first and last name. So to register for future presentations in the DTx series, you can visit foundationforwellness.com/DTx. Our speakers do have some financial disclosures. Dr. Benjamin Alouf is the executive for Limbix, chief medical officer for fractional for Digital Therapeutics Alliance, advisor for June App, Big Health, Anika, and Sersha. Dr. Parks has disclosed she is the shareholder of Dario Health, consultant for Found Health, Lucid, Wealthy, Curvet, Credo, at TI Therapeutics, Arcade Therapeutics, Lindis Health, Dopavision, Jimny, Aleco, Retain Health, full-time contract employee for Unmind, and a part-time contract employee for at TI Therapeutics. Dr. Benjamin Alouf has spent 30 years in the healthcare space as faculty, attending physician and division chief in large hospital organizations. He has been a health plan medical director and executive, as well as a chief medical officer of a digital therapeutic company developing software as a medical device for adolescent mental health. He currently serves as the chief medical officer of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, working on educating clinicians seeking more options of healthcare for their patients, improving patient access to these essential therapies, working with health plans to assure a pathway to reimbursement, and advocating for legislation and regulations to assure the future success of digital therapeutics. Dr. Acacia Parks is a digital health executive whose experience revolves around scientific, product, and regulatory strategy for digital therapeutic software as medical device. Her work spans 11 different companies, 17 different indications, including cancer, obesity, treatment, resistant depression, Alzheimer's, social anxiety, ADHD, and chronic disease. She specializes in products with high scientific and regulatory complexity, including combined hardware, software packages of action and delivery methods, and combination of drugs/DTx products. Very excited to welcome our two speakers. As a reminder, we do have the chat feature and the Q&A feature enabled. If you have specific questions for our two speakers, please put that in the Q&A, and they will be monitoring throughout their session, and they'll maybe answer it throughout the session, as well as we'll save some time at the end to answer everyone's questions. So I'm turning over the floor to Dr. Alouf and Dr. Parks. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So we're going to get started. Thank you for the introductions. Really excited to be here. Let me just advance the slide. So upon completion of this activity, participants will be better able to differentiate types of digital therapeutics based on regulatory pathways, educate patients on research and regulations of digital therapeutics, identify barriers to patient and clinician adoption of digital therapeutics, as well as respond to reimbursement questions from patients regarding digital therapeutics. Financial disclosures you've already heard about. So, you know, we're gonna, for those of you who attended session 1, there was more of an overview and introduction to digital therapeutics, but we're gonna just go back again just for a sentence or two, just to remind people, or in case you didn't see the first session. And digital therapeutics, although there have been various definitions and interpretations, in June of 2023, so about a year ago, the International Organization for Standards came up with a very specific definition that is now pretty much universally accepted as the definition of a digital therapeutics. of digital therapeutics. And what that is, it's healthcare software that's intended to treat or alleviate a disease, a disorder, a condition, or an injury by generating and delivering a medical intervention that has a demonstrable positive therapeutic impact on a patient's health. So that's very important. It's very brief. There are lots of other things to it, as you can imagine, organizationally, and a lot of footnotes and other explanations, but that is generally what is the intent and the summary of what a digital therapeutic is. So whether they're used independently, in tandem with remote or in-person clinician-delivered therapy, if they're paired with medications, other devices, or other therapies, they stand behind Digital Therapeutics Alliance, which is the trade organization for digital therapeutics and digital therapeutic companies who help design and develop this definition, stands behind the rigorous patient-centered core principles, ethical standards, and product development best practices to ensure product integrity, user-centered designs, patient privacy, and validated clinical outcomes. And a lot of this information was derived from the Digital Therapeutic Alliance. They were very much instrumental in the development of the definition and the need for a consistent approach to what digital therapeutics are. Again, eight principles of digital therapeutics. They incorporate design, manufacturing, quality best practices. They engage users end-to-end in the development of the product. They incorporate patient privacy and security. These are cleared products, and we take HIPAA, privacy, and security very seriously. These products do not sell to third parties. They don't rely on advertisement. That would not be a digital therapeutic. They apply product deployment, management, and maintenance best practices. You're going to hear Acacia talk about quality standards and regulatory standards that they need to adhere to. V&V practices, validation, and verification that the products are working as intended and are resulting in the outcomes as they claim. Results need to be published. There has to be vigorous randomized controlled trials, and those results need to be published in peer-reviewed journals. They, of course, need to be reviewed and cleared or approved by regulatory bodies. In the United States, that would be the FDA. But it's important to understand that many of these are devices. They're cleared, they're not approved. And so sometimes you'll hear us clarify when people say, is your device approved? Approval is, at least through the FDA, it's not the method. And Acacia will talk some more about the regulatory process, but the appropriate terminology is cleared, not approved. They make claims that are appropriate to clinical validation and regulatory status. So they can only make claims that they have proven and shown that they can make, and they're confined to that. And those claims are based on the aforementioned clinical studies and trials that they ran. And then finally, they collect, analyze, and apply real-world evidence and product performance data. Again, that is not meant for commercial purposes. It's meant for product improvement. It's meant for post-marketing surveillance to make sure the device is working as it should. It's also to generate data for the provider to improve patient care. So I'm going to hand it over now to Acacia to take over the regulatory part of this discussion.
Great, thanks. So this is just an outline of what I'm going to cover. We're going to talk a bit about the different regulatory categories that are out there. And a lot of what I do is help companies figure out for what kind of thing they want to claim their product does, what regulatory category would that put them in, and then what kind of evidence do they need. And so these things really go hand in hand. And we'll talk about what kind of key factors affect which category a product falls under. After that, we'll talk a bit about what it means to be a company in each of these regulatory categories and how the regulatory and evidence requirements change. And then lastly, I'll talk a bit about the commercial differences for these categories. What are the different pathways that products can take depending on their regulatory status and evidence. Next slide. So this figure just sort of captures the sort of progression of more and more regulation and what tries to encapsulate what what factors contribute to that. So on the farthest kind of left side, the least regulated is wellness. So these are things that are, they're boosting your well-being. Like we'll talk specifically about what that means, but they're not claiming to do any of the things that Dr. Alouf described on the previous slides. They're not trying to treat anything. They're not invoking a disease. And because of that, they're under no regulation whatsoever, right? Because they're not making a claim that falls under the purview of the FDA. Which is part of Homeland Security, interestingly. So it's like it's literally protecting the health and wellness of the United States. And in this case, we're not really talking about a threat to that. Now, there's an area called kind of enforcement discretion we'll talk about, or exemption. So there are certain types of products that are in a type of product that has just been done so many times. There's not a lot of concern that they would be unsafe. There's not a ton of concern that they wouldn't work because the efficacy or the effectiveness has been shown over and over again. And so there are certain 510K exemption categories. Specifically, there are some biofeedback products, and there are some cognitive assessment aid products that don't need to go through clearance, but are nevertheless a medical device under 510K exemption. So these are just really low risk or kind of de-risked by virtue of precedent devices. Then we get into the categories. So these last three are products that have to go through FDA clearance, meaning they have to make a submission to FDA, present their evidence, present their intended use, and get FDA's kind of rubber stamp or clearance that they're allowed to market under those claims. And so a 510K is one where you are essentially able to cite another product that's similar, which in some ways de-risks the clearance, right? Because something similar has already been through a more rigorous process. The 510K process is still quite rigorous in digital therapeutics. I want to be clear. There are types of products, like, if you have a blood pressure cuff and you show that it's just like all the other blood pressure cuffs, you may not even have to submit any new data to show that your product is safe and effective. But in digital therapeutics, no matter how much there's another product that's similar, at this stage in the game, you still have to show that your product is safe and effective with data. So when you see that something's been through a 510K versus a de novo, which is when you have something totally new, you create a new regulation when it gets clearance. When you hear about either types of these clearance in digital therapeutics, it's extremely rigorous. They've done a lot, years and years of tightly controlled research. So this is really a category apart from the unregulated wellness and enforcement discretion or exemption categories, where FDA really hasn't evaluated. And that's important to point out, because one of the things we'll talk about is that there are some products that can still call themselves medical devices that are in this exemption or this unassessed category, where they may be able to say, oh, we're a medical device, but it doesn't mean the same thing. It means if I hear something's been through 510K, like I know that a lot has been done to assess its safety and effectiveness. That isn't necessarily always the case, because we have this middle exemption and enforcement discretion category. So we'll disentangle what those things are. For now, I think it's important to kind of keep in mind that divide between exemption and pre-market notification, right? There's like has been through FDA clearance and has not been evaluated by the FDA. And we'll try and disentangle that with some examples now. Next.
And then pre-market approval, which is not.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it wouldn't be, and that was the difference between being cleared and, for instance, saying something was approved. Yeah.
Right, which has not happened in digital therapeutics.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so here there are three things that affect regulatory status of a digital health product. The first, which we're going to talk about next, is marketing claims. So that's what you're saying your product does. And there are certain types of claims that require evaluation by the FDA and other types of claims that do not. I'm talking about the US now, but there are similar processes for other countries. The risk profile, which we'll talk about in a minute, just kind of like how much risk are we talking about here? Like what happens if things go catastrophically wrong with this product? How bad would that be? And depending on that level of risk, if the product disappeared and it's keeping your heart running, right, that's a different level of risk than if a product disappears and you might be uncomfortable for a minute. Or you might just not have access to it, but nothing terrible happens. We'll also talk about use case, meaning like when is it being used and how much is the doctor in the loop. So those are the three areas we'll cover. Let's dive into marketing.
Oh, yeah.
Next, yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so these are examples of wellness type claims. Now, when I show you wellness and enforcement discretion type claims, there's no like registry of wellness products, or so I just literally went to products on the internet that seemed to me like they fit in this category. I can't prove that they do. I know at least one of these products has specifically gone to FDA, showed their intended use, and said, "We're a wellness product, right?" And FDA said, "Yes, you are." Right. So there's a pathway called the 513G where sometimes companies will do that just to make sure that they are marketing appropriately in the wellness space. So New Mood, for example, has the claim that they'll bring you more joy and less stress. Right. Nothing clinical evoked here. It might stress sort of may refer to depression and anxiety, but in a very kind of indirect way. Calm.com, right? Find your calm. Our goal is to help you improve your health and happiness. Or Headspace lists as its mission to improve the health and happiness of the world. So these are examples of wellness type claims. They're not evaluated by the FDA at all. They're not regulated. As long as you stay in this area, you can kind of claim what you want, which is where we get into some crazy stuff with supplements, right? Where like you can say like, oh, supports hair wellness. And it's like, what does it mean to support the wellness of hair? But it's just not evaluated by the FDA. Next.
Right. And that's different from saying you treat anxiety or you treat chronic insomnia, which is very specific, right? So.
Right. So as soon as you evoke a disease, you might be encroaching into what is called enforcement discretion territory. Now, if you're in Europe, that might be a class 1 device because you're evoking an illness and you're doing something in relation to it. But in the United States, this group of interventions has essentially been identified by the FDA as so low risk that they do not have the bandwidth to evaluate it. So even though in a perfect world they would evaluate it, they would consider it a medical device, they just can't, right? They have too much going on. They want to focus on the places where risk is higher. And so these are things that are also not evaluated by the FDA, even though in a perfect world they would be. Now, that's quite a lot of gray area there. But these products can say a bit more. And this is a place where like there's no database of like who's enforcement discretion. So I can't prove to you that these particular companies are, but they're examples of claims that you could operate under enforcement discretion and say, you're a medical device under some of these claims. So, Living Well by Prosoma, which I'll disclose was a client of mine at one point, but they say that they're providing mental health support to women recently diagnosed with cancer or undergoing treatment. They're not treating cancer, right? And they're not treating depression or anxiety. Providing mental health support does imply something that could involve depression and anxiety, and that's okay. You can say symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety. We have these sort of lowering your risk of developing type 2 diabetes, or even more amorphous things like closing gaps in care to manage hypertension. What does it mean to manage hypertension? Right? It's not saying that you're treating it. It's not saying you're curing it. You're just doing something that has an impact on it. These are all great examples of enforcement discretion claims or enforcement discretion type claims where you're invoking a clinical condition, you're saying something about or around it, but you're definitely not mitigating or treating it in a very direct way. You're not making claims of that. So in this category, there is absolutely no evidence requirement in order to market yourself in this way. Although the FDA has a sort of general blanket statement of like, you should have evidence, most of the time these companies are not vetted in relation to their evidence. They're not evaluated or audited because, as FDA has said, they do not wish to enforce at this level of risk. So there are products out there like this, and they may say, hey, we're a medical device. Hey, we're FDA registered. Okay, what that means is that they filled out a form and sent it to the FDA saying we're a medical device company, and they paid $6,000. That is what it means to be FDA registered. It technically might mean that they're following some quality systems and so on. It may mean that they're following best practices for manufacturing. But because this is an area that FDA has deliberately said they do not intend to enforce any of that, you can't count on it. So this is a tricky thing when it comes to discerning the difference between, there are digital therapeutic products out there, and I do not work with Big Health, though I think Dr. Alouf had said that he did. Big Health has tons of scientific evidence, right? And they make claims at times that are in the enforcement discretion space, but they mean it, man. Like there's a lot of evidence. You can find it and read it. They produce a lot of science. And there are other products in the enforcement discretion space where there isn't a lot of scientific evidence and none of it's enforced. So it's on the company and what the company feels is right. There's just a lot more leeway. Now, when you get into FDA cleared type claims, this is where you have an intended use, you have labeling, just like a drug. And the FDA has specifically looked at that intended use, held it up against the evidence that you present, and evaluated whether the evidence justifies your ability to make the claims that you're trying to make. So when you see something that's FDA cleared, those claims, FDA has looked at them quite carefully, right? So Endeavor RX, which is Achilles prescription treatment for ADHD, the first FDA authorized prescription video game treatment, right? So the word treatment can appear in this type of claim. You cannot see that anywhere else if people are following the rules in enforcement discretion and so on. Other products, I didn't label specifically which these come from, but lasting recovery from anxiety, I think this is big health, that's available anytime, anywhere, right? So they're making claims it's available anytime, anywhere, not regulated claims. Recovery from anxiety is a strong claim, right? We're not just saying that we might relieve your anxiety temporarily right this second. We're not saying that we might sort of like gently mitigate your anxiety symptoms. Recovery from anxiety implies that you're being cured or significantly ameliorated. So that's a relatively strong claim. And at some point, Big Health was marketing with FDA cleared claims during a waiver that existed via COVID. Essentially, mental health products were allowed to market as if they were FDA cleared, just to get these solutions out to the general public. So I believe that's where that language came from. Mahana IBS, FDA cleared, uses cognitive behavioral therapy to reduce IBM symptom severity. So this is more gentle as claims go, but sometimes you see claims that are a bit more dialed back because FDA sees the evidence and doesn't feel that the evidence justifies a strong word like recovery or amelioration, right? So the very specific language of the claims that appear in an FDA cleared product, FDA has looked at every single word and thought about what that word means and whether that word matches to the evidence. It's a very painstaking process. Or neurobehavioral virtual reality treatment for chronic pain. Again, we're using the word treatment, hallmark kind of FDA cleared language. So hopefully at this point, we're clear on the difference between things that have not been evaluated by the FDA, the wellness and enforcement discretion language. We are familiar with kind of what it looks like when something has been FDA cleared. And as you'll note, you can't tell the difference between de novo and 510K in any of this language. Like it all essentially, the outcome looks the same. It's just kind of what the process was on the back end to get the clearance. But you don't see different claims between 510K and de novo as far as I know. Now, the other thing that I hope you've taken away from this is that enforcement discretion is this weird gray area in the middle where actually the line would be further over if FDA had infinite resources, but they don't. So there are certain things you might see where you're like, wow, FDA really should evaluate that. And yes, hypothetically, it would be great if they could. In Europe, those types of claims do get evaluated at the same level. Those are class 1 medical devices. So just some things to keep in mind. Okay, so when you're in these 3 different categories, what does that mean for a company? What does that mean for what the company has to do and demonstrate? So in wellness, there's no requirement for a quality system. What a quality system means in a really broad term is a system for tracking and documenting what goes on in the company, whether certain procedures are followed the same every time. For example, there are a lot of like kind of SOP requirements. It could be about kind of data quality and monitoring. It could be about tracking product development and keeping track of when changes are made to the product. So wellness is a total free-for-all, like anything is possible. And there are areas of wellness where HIPAA compliance, you don't have to do it. Right? So like there are certain use cases where you just don't. So you don't see that as much in enforcement discretion, and you never see it in an FDA cleared product because part of being FDA cleared is demonstrating that you have quality systems in place. You're following all of the compliance requirements. Now, the trick is in enforcement discretion, you really should be doing those things. FDA strongly encourages you to do those things, but they have chosen not to enforce it. So in the end, it is up to the company to decide how much they're going to comply. That said, any company that eventually intends to get FDA clearance, like they might be hanging out in enforcement discretion, gathering data, real world data, kind of getting ready to make that submission, they're going to do all the quality systems anyway because they need it. But you just don't know, right? There's just not as much when you see that FDA registered, like it could mean anything. In terms of evidence, right, wellness, you just need whatever evidence it takes to sell the product. So I used to sell, the Happify Health product to employers, to health plans. And so our burden of evidence back then as a wellness product was just literally what the customer needed to see in order to decide they wanted to buy the product. So in that case, there was no evidence requirement back in 2011 when we first started doing these things. Now you need randomized trials and so on, but those are required by the buyer. There's no regulatory requirement. There's no kind of compliance requirement that has to do with evidence. Now, in enforcement discretion, you're going to make medical device claims. You're going to claim that you're, mitigating symptoms or kind of doing some things to kind of like lightly operate on a disease. It's still evidence only required by the buyer, right? Because remember, FDA is not evaluating these claims, but buyers tend to expect more because you might be demanding a higher price point. You're certainly making stronger claims. And at some point, depending on who the buyer is, they're going to want to see more. But again, it's not required on the regulatory side. For FDA cleared, there are rigorous evidence requirements. Companies often have multiple conversations back and forth with the FDA where they submit descriptions of the evidence they plan to gather and ask FDA for feedback. And then when they kind of execute that mutually agreed upon research, then the clearance is awarded. So that evidence is kind of determined by an FDA panel, and it's required by not only FDA, but then customers and payers for reimbursement if reimbursement is the path that's desirable. So there's just a lot more evidence of a lot of different kinds required for FDA cleared products compared to the other products here. Peer-reviewed publication, again, in wellness, like we used to do it because I thought it was important. Acacia thought it was important. I don't know that our employer clients at the time thought it was important to have peer-reviewed publications. It's certainly not required in wellness. Once you get into enforcement discretion, again, you're making clinical claims, so you're more likely to see peer-reviewed publications, but it's kind of the typical standard, but again, it's not required. With FDA cleared, you're doing publication quality research. It's going to be in clinicaltrials.gov, whether you like it or not. Right, it's all going to be kind of out there for people to see. And then on top of that, there's additional types of evidence, really completely different types of evidence needed for reimbursement than for that initial clearance, where you're more focused on return on investment and cost compared to standard care and so on. FDA is concerned with safety and effectiveness, and so the focus of the studies is different, and that's all dictated by FDA and FDA cleared products, and not dictated by FDA at all in the other categories.
Yeah, and you mentioned the COVID enforcement discretion. That was specifically for digital therapeutics that treat psychiatric conditions. Yeah. So I think clinicians are and that had expired in May. I believe there was a 180-day waiting period to decide whether you were going to go ahead and submit or not. So I think that's where you're going to see a lot of clinicians getting exposure to these products that may have been under enforcement and are either or not going through a more stringent regulatory pathway. And I think, what you have highlighted here is just so important to understand, because you're right, it's very gray. The wellness of the wellness, I think that's a little more straightforward. But when you're sort of transitioning from enforcement discretion to a regulated product, it's not always so clear. And it is so important for clinicians to understand the difference, because they're also the ones that are going to be educating their patients on it. And their patients may be coming to them saying, hey, I see this thing has got this FDA thing on it. What does that mean? It's clear cut with medications, right? It's clear cut with hardware devices that clinicians are used to using. But I think in digital therapeutics have become even more important to know the difference. And I think what we've also seen is the requirements and the rigor of evidence has increased through the years.
It does. It's like an arms race, right? So like if everybody has this level, then the first company to come forward with the next step, now everybody's got to do that next step. And I certainly saw this happen in early days with Happify/Twill, where I used to be chief science officer, where in the beginning, nobody had any randomized studies at all. There was like hardly any evidence, and it was all correlational. And we came in with the first randomized trial. And then before we knew it, everybody else had 3 randomized trials, and it was off to the races. So yeah, definitely this is a changing standard over time, and what FDA wants to see and needs to see changes over time too, which is why it's so important to understand that it's a back and forth with them. It's a conversation where you figure out, today, what do you need to see? But 10 years from now, what they need to see to clear a major depressive disorder product is going to be different from what they needed to clear Click Therapeutics for the first major depressive disorder product, right?
Yep.
When it's the first, and then, those things evolve over time.
Yep.
Okay, so some key considerations when you do see FDA cleared products, what they've been asked to do. And what types of kind of studies are they being expected to do? In terms of control arms, for most psychiatric conditions and some other conditions, many other conditions as well, I've seen it in ophthalmology, for example, there's the understanding that the importance here is to show that the digital product is doing more than an inert digital product. So there's an expectation that you're going to capture like the hope you get from being given an app and like the behavioral activation from using the app and the feeling convinced because this app looks so fancy that it's going to help me. All of those things have to be accounted for in the comparison arm. So you have your product and then you would be randomized between that and a sham product, and you would need to see a clinically significant advantage of your product. These are really hard to power studies, right? You need a lot of people to find the relatively small difference you see between an active control. This is not, for example, a non-inferiority study that you might do to just show this is similar to treatment as usual, but more scalable, right? Which is like might be an argument that you'd want to see as a provider, that this is, similar to an antidepressant, but it doesn't have side effects, for example. FDA is not interested in that argument, right? FDA is particularly interested in the scientific validity of your claim, right, that this thing works. And so they want to see that you've taken into account all the sort of placebo effect expectation things. Now, some disorders require more care towards that than others. Major depressive disorder has major placebo effects, right? Huge placebo effects that you see in data, huge regression to the mean. These are things you really want to take into account in your comparison group. And so when something makes it through, like Click Therapeutics, you can't imagine, I can't imagine the rigmaroles they must have gone through to sort of demonstrate that that rigorous type of study. They definitely had to be doing placebo controls. In terms of endpoints, FDA is really concerned with objectivity, right? They're not so interested in self-reported symptom scores. Those are often secondary outcome measures, but FDA often wants to see, if available, objective measures. So in mental health, for example, which is my primary area, they're very interested in clinician interviews. They want a clinician to talk to a patient before and after using the product and to be able to tell that they got better, or to be able to sort of detect that they're less depressed than they were before or less anxious than they were before. And that's kind of the gold standard. And they have very particular ways that they want to see outcomes demonstrated for each disease area based on what the scientific literature says. Very rigorous is my point, right? So we're looking at objective measures, often more expensive to gather, right? You might be able to get like a blood biomarker, also objective, also, depending on your disease area. And this is awkward because depending on who you're trying to show the value of your product to, there are different types of studies you want to do. And like, I'll tell you, like employers are not super compelled or interested in placebos, for example. It's a very esoteric research thing to want to look at a difference compared to a placebo, as opposed to something that's a bit more obviously practically meaningful, like a comparison with standard care. And so what often happens is digital therapeutics companies going through clearance are faced with having to do 2 very large studies, one to please FDA and one or more to please reimbursement standards. And Dr. Alouf will talk more about that a bit later, but because there are different study designs for different stakeholders, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to do it all in one study. That ends up being a really big hurdle for DTx companies who are trying to go the cleared route. That's why a lot of companies, I think, hang out in enforcement discretion territory where they just have a lot more freedom to do the study that means something to their purchasers, as opposed to having to please multiple masters.
Yeah, it's so challenging to create a control, right? Because what is the active ingredient that you can identify within the digital therapeutic that separates it from control? It's not as simple as a medication. When one is, you have the molecule, and then the other one you have, a sugar pill, right? Here, a lot of these, that's one of the biggest challenges in creating, and I think it can't be understated. or overstated, I should say, can't be overstated, that developing a control arm is very difficult in creating a sham device.
It is, and it's costly. So like in addition to having to create a second product essentially, and that product you may have to iterate to get it to a point where you can find a difference, right? You might, I see this a lot. Companies will accidentally include an active ingredient in what they think is a sham, and then they discover it actually like really does something meaningful to patients when you talk to them after they used it. It's like, whoops. So like, I'll give you an example. I once made a supposedly inert version where the patients were keeping a journal, a gratitude journal, and they were writing all of these different positive things in their lives. It's supposed to retrain their attention, et cetera, et cetera. There's a comparison group where they were asked to write down things that happened in their lives, and the idea was that you write down some good things, you write down some bad things. In the end, it's not like the same positive attention retraining otherwise, but they're in a treatment. So guess what they do? They write down positive things, even though you didn't ask them to write down positive things. So sometimes people can kind of overthink themselves into accidentally doing the intervention when you try and give them something inert. So yes, it is very, very challenging. So yeah, there's concern about the placebo effect in all products. As I said before, this is just, I think, to summarize what the most appropriate control group for a product or a study is depends on whether it's possible to create a placebo. And so like I've heard examples of companies that, Free Spirit is a great example. They do biofeedback for panic. So if you're breathing in a certain way that helps with panic, breathing in other ways causes panic. And giving somebody bogus biofeedback could induce a panic attack. And there's an argument to be made that you don't want to be causing that kind of distress inadvertently. And so there are occasionally arguments that like this is just not a place where it's clinically appropriate to be doing a placebo. I would say the places where FDA accepts that argument are almost never, even when the cost can be relatively high. For example, in an ophthalmology use case, I've definitely seen feedback from FDA that even if patients in a sham may degrade in their vision over the course of a year washout, that's just important data to see, which is really tough to think about. Like that's kids getting blind. So if you think about things that are progressive conditions, needing to be able to see if you've slowed the progression of a condition means you've got to leave some people progressing. And that can be really, really ethically challenging for some companies to think about, well, okay, well, at what point do we just pull them out of the study, right? Because this is not okay. And how do we design studies with the safety of our patients at the forefront, given that FDA has to see the comparison data as well. Yeah. And I think also if FDA is more comfortable with what you're doing, they're more willing to accept arguments that change what they're looking for. But if you're doing something for the first time, they kind of need to see what they need to see. I'm going to kind of skip through this about endpoints because I think I already covered it, the sort of objectivity. But this is the important thing. FDA is not the only stakeholder for endpoints, right? So to FDA, objectivity is important, but to health plans, they want to hear about financial outcomes and quality of life. They want to see uncontrolled real-world data, like how are people actually using this, not in your clinical study where you can call them all the time and be like, why aren't you using my app? But like what actually happens when you unleash this on the world? Employers want to hear about health outcomes tied to workplace engagement or work satisfaction. And for self-insured employers, they also want to take all of the same things into consideration as health plans. Providers want to see evidence that it works, that it's safe, but like FDA is evaluating whether it works and is safe using their priorities, and those priorities might not be the same as providers in terms of what they're looking for. Providers may, for example, understand that clinician interviews for depression are pretty flawed. They may not like seeing that as an outcome, and they want to see other outcomes. Just as an example, there are real problems with clinician interviews, just as much as there are assets. They want to know the liability associated with the product. They want to know what the patient cost is going to be. They want to know if it's going to fit in their workflow. FDA doesn't care about workflow. That's not their purview, right? So you need to also have data about that if you want to be appealing to providers. Patients want to know that it's going to be easy to use, it's going to fit in their life, that it's going to be covered by their insurance, that it's engaging, and that it's actually going to make them feel and function better, and in what time frame it will. So there are all kinds of different concerns of all kinds of different stakeholders, and so endpoints have to, and studies that people design for their products have to take all of these into account, knowing who's looking.
Yeah, and there are things that come up like ClinRO, clinician reported outcomes. human factor testing that all go into this as well. Is
Yeah.
you know, our clinicians reporting just based on their observation and seeing the patient longitudinally over the course of the study that they're seeing improvement or changes in functioning, because the FDA likes to see not just biomarker changes, but are there also improvements in functioning?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then there's human factor testing. Are people engaging with the product appropriately? Is it not triggering other conditions inadvertently? You know, so a lot goes into this.
Yeah.
If that's a take-home message, right?
That's a good opening for your, I think, your next section, which I think I'm just gonna very briefly go over this and then hand it on. Oh, this is actually you'll do this one, yes?
Yeah,
The
I
commercial
can go ahead.
differences. Oh yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Okay, so
Sure.
perfect segue.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Dr. Parks. This is really good. This is really important for everybody to really fully understand. So looking at the commercial differences, and this is where really the rubber hits the road, right? Because these are manufacturers, and just like any other manufacturer, their product needs to be out of the market and then need to be able to be generate revenue from it to survive as a company. In healthcare, people don't expect to pay for their goods and services, right? They pay a premium to a health plan, and they expect the health plan to cover those goods and services, at least to some degree. So in terms of the commercial differences, wellness products, they're they have the lowest price point. Usually these are direct to consumer. The expectation is that the consumer is going to pay for this directly. Occasionally some of these go through employer, like an employer benefit type of plan or employer assistance program, but still it's a pretty low price point. And there's no need for prescription. Providers generally are not involved, and honestly, a lot of employers don't even want that. They want as little friction for their employees to be able to access these products. Under enforcement discretion, as you've learned, it's between wellness and FDA cleared price point. It can be more flexible. Still requires a quality system, a QMS, and then again, generally, patients tend to pay out of pocket. Also, employers offer it, but you don't need in the vernacular, a prescription or some kind of authorization from a provider to obtain the product. So no involvement of the provider. For FDA cleared, that is the highest price point theoretically. Generally, prescription drugs are more expensive than OTC drugs or supplements and things like that. There is some direct-to-consumer marketing through health plans, but mostly this is, companies go to providers and just like a rep would go to a provider to talk about a device or a pharmaceutical, they talk about these digital therapeutics. There's limited product flexibility because we didn't get into that previously during the regulatory process. But if you're going to change the efficacy or something in your product is going to potentially change the safety, or you would like to add additional indications, you have to go through some degree of the process. And again, it's very complicated, as like you can imagine. You still have to go through some degree of the process. So if you have a depression out there, that your claims are that you treat major depressive disorder, and then you decide that, we did a little study and we found that this may also help anxiety, we're going to tag that on. You can't really do that. You can't simply add an additional indication or additional claim. You're going to have to kind of walk through the process to at least some degree over again. It does require physician involvement. Patients may pay out of pocket. There's limited coverage right now. Some Medicaid, some states cover, some commercial plans do cover it. The VA covers some products, but what's ending up is a lot of patients, at least as of the date of this webinar, they might have to pay out of pocket because health plans, commercial and public, may not be covering it. This spider web, as I call it, is, we want to talk about workflow. That's really just been, getting ironed out. Clinicians are used to getting on their EMR. When they see a patient needs a drug, they start typing it into the orders. They get a drop down, they click. It goes either to the pharmacy or a printout for the patient to take to, a DME supplier or something like that. This is for digital therapeutics, as you saw. Some of them are connected devices, some are not. Some are strictly software. Some are delivered through VR headsets. Very complicated, and that is something that we're working towards, and we're working with providers and other industry leaders as to how can we make it. As you heard, one of the things that providers are very concerned about, how is this going to affect my workflow? We know clinicians are terribly overworked. Burnout is a real thing, and it's causing a lot of issues. And we want this. The intention of these products is to improve access. And if they're creating additional workflow issues for providers and they're not giving it to their patients, and that kind of defeats that purpose. So this will be simplified. So just to summarize, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. I don't see anything in the Q&A yet, and hopefully folks have lots of questions. So where do digital therapeutics fit in healthcare? So as you can see on the left side, you see the non-clinical grade options. On the right side are clinical grade options. There are monitoring devices on both sides. There are diagnostic devices on both sides. There are treatment decision assistance on both sides for providers and clinicians. And then there are the treatment and ongoing care. And as you can see highlighted, digital therapeutics are clinical grade options for clinicians to use for treatment and ongoing care. Lastly, and this is available through the Digital Therapeutics library of educational material. Is this a DTx? So you start off, does it provide an intervention that is used in the context of healthcare? Obviously, the answer has to be yes, right? So we'll start off with that. Does it treat, manage, or prevent a disease or disorder? If you remember the first slide, that's the very fundamental definition of a digital therapeutic. If the answer is yes, if the clinician has the sole responsibility for delivering the intervention, it's probably not a DTx. If it's a standalone, does a standalone medication or pharmaceutical provide the intervention, it's probably not a DTx. But is software predominantly responsible for providing the intervention to the patient via technology platform, through a device? If the answer is yes to that, then you go to the last frame. Has it been designed, manufactured using quality best practices? You heard Dr. Parks talk about some of the requirements for that. Does it engage end users in product development and usability, incorporate patient privacy, HIPAA requirements, apply product deployment management and maintenance best practices, have a QMS system in place, published clinical trials in peer-reviewed journals, has it been authorized by a regulatory body? You heard about specifically the FDA, but there are other bodies, in Europe that work about a slightly different way. Does it make claims that are appropriate to clinical evaluation and regulatory status? Does it match what it says with what it's been cleared for? And does it collect, analyze, and apply real-world evidence and product performance for patient care? And that is for product enhancement, product improvement, for the required post-marketing surveillance of outcomes with patients that are using it. But also, a lot of these devices have the ability for providers to access results and engagement data directly from patients using it. And if all that is, as you migrate down, it's like that thing where they call it the waterfall, right? You throw the ball and it kind of drops down into a little slot. If all that drops to the bottom slot, then the product is likely a DTx. And I think that is our last slide. Yes. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm not sure. I didn't see anything in the Q&A. Are there any questions or? If not, one of the things Dr. Parks was talking about is the different requirements that you see in terms of evidence generation. So one of the things that digital therapeutics are being called upon to generate are health economics outcomes research, which there's interest in understanding how the deployment of digital therapeutics through a healthcare plan or a health system can result in overall not just effectiveness and safety and clinical outcomes, but also cost outcomes. Can you reduce overall costs of care by using these devices? So that's another piece of evidence that, again, the FDA is not going to ask you, did you run health economics outcomes research study? But it's important for digital therapeutic companies to run that, because once they get their clearance and they get providers to like it and they get patients to say, yeah, this is, we like this product, they need to get it reimbursed. And health plans, as well as health systems that may be vertically integrated or looking for the tools to manage them through population health or through value-based contracting, then they're going to have to show that there is something there. And one of the things that they're also being asked to do is, Dr. Parks was speaking of the studies that show efficacy versus a control, but the added evidence when you approach payers is, how do you compare to existing treatment and the existing management of the condition? So not really a control. There are these therapeutics that run what's called control arms that are either usual care or care as usual, and that is something that is part of their evidence generation. But it is becoming more rigorous and more stringent in terms of actually showing dollar returns and comparing to what other people are using, not just usual care.
Well, and in contrast, if you look at how some parts of Europe, Germany and France are handling regulation and reimbursement as a single kind of, it's not a single transaction, but it's a much more integrated process where there's thought to this idea that if you have regulatory clearance, it should mean something for reimbursement. And there's some ability to kind of take evidence and use it for both purposes. There are other countries that are doing this differently, and I wouldn't say that it's necessarily better or worse, but it is more thoughtful to this one particular issue of the different types of evidence for different types of purposes and how to get things through with a kind of more unified processes, which exist in other places and we can potentially learn from. I think we are learning.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, no questions. I don't know if people can put in the chat or something. Do people have familiarity with digital therapeutics? Are people using them? Are they?
It's very new information to the audience. Anybody have questions or comments?
It looks like somebody was mentioning we are not using it in Louisiana. Okay. And Nicole, what type of clinician are you?
Yeah, we're looking at the chat now, so you don't have to use the Q&A function anymore. Yeah. We can go either way.
Maria says she's a social worker and she does not have familiarity with these programs.
Okay.
So if this is new to you, I think the Digital Therapeutics Alliance and DIME are both organizations that have extremely informative resources, and the FDA itself has a Center for Digital Health Excellence that has further great resources in terms of understanding where products fit and how to kind of interpret what's out there. So those are three great places: the Center for Digital Health, or the Digital Health Center for Excellence at FDA, DIME, like the currency, and the Digital Therapeutics Alliance.
So I see here a comment about BetterHelp, but if you kind of go down that little, I forget what that carnival game is, BetterHelp would not necessarily be considered a digital therapeutics.
But BetterHelp is also care providers, right?
Yeah.
So it's like there's a telemedicine kind of question of what happens when you translate something to something that's supposed to be highly scalable, remote, sometimes digital, and not necessarily even live conversation. Sorry, my garage door is opening. It's making this horrible sound. I apologize. And so those, there are lots of organizations out there like that, but a lot of what we're talking about are digital products alone, right? Products that we're claiming do treatment things, as opposed to I might have a care provider who's remote and I'm claiming that their care is leading to better outcomes. In this case, we're saying it's actually the digital product that's carrying the weight. It's not the practice of medicine, it's something else.
I see Summer mentioned, and many people.
Yeah.
Summer mentioned, and many people ask if there's any research showing it's worth it. So, here's sort of, you can look at individual companies. You can go to the .gov, clinicaltrials.gov website that Dr. Parks mentioned, and actually read the studies that these device manufacturers submitted in order to get their clearance or to run their feasibility trials, to run their pivotal trials.
You can even see, though, like if you go to Headspace's website, you can see dozens of studies, and there are other companies where you can't find any studies. And that doesn't mean the studies weren't done, right? Different companies have different philosophies if they're not required to report on their research. But in general, if you see research there, it's a good sign. And they didn't have to do it, right? They did it because as a company, they wanted to make that information available to the public, and they wanted to test their efficacy. And there are some companies that have looked at the research and said, well, cognitive therapy works, so let's put it in an app. It's probably fine. I'm not exaggerating. That is, that's a whole approach, right? You can say, look, previous research found this works, so let's just assume it's going to work when we make it digital. Other companies come back around and say, well, what if we messed it up when we made it digital? Like, how do we know it's working? And you can sometimes find that on their websites where they will list the research underlying what they're doing, and they're not just referring to some study that some researcher in a university did that they think that they're kind of capturing. They'll actually show research on the product that they are marketing.
Yeah, and I see here social worker comment. One of the things that you do when you submit to the FDA is there's a whole section on labeling and who's able to provide or offer or authorize different terminologies used your product. And that is something that's looked at as well. What level provider and the again, part of the complexity of all this is in terms of individual state licensing and what do the boards allow individual clinicians, whether they be social workers or psychologists, what is within their purview and what is it within their board licensing abilities to dispense certain therapies.
Yeah, and I think there's very much this, because these products are new, they should be only administered in adjunct with other care, not as a standalone treatment, and that they need to be prescribed and overseen by a physician. And then you see cases like Acacia recently got an OTC clearance where they now have a version that can be distributed over the counter without a prescription. But that wasn't how it started, right? You don't see these sort of outright clearances for like, I can just hand it out to somebody and make these claims. There's this sort of early wariness where something has to be prescribed now, but maybe 5 years from now, data will show that it's safe enough and low risk enough that it's not necessary. So that's a trend you'll see changing in terms of going from just like, it has to be a psychiatrist to it could be a GP to it could be all kinds of other care providers. And depending on the product, that's part of the negotiation with the FDA is who can prescribe it, and then expanding who can prescribe it over time, or expanding it so that it no longer requires a prescription.
Yep.
And I think we're out of time, unfortunately. Now we have so many great questions. Thank you for all the great interaction. I was so scared at first, but
I know.
I think yeah,
it took a while. I think everyone was sinking in all the information. And like I said, this is a very new topic to our audience, and a lot of people say that they're not using it. They're very unfamiliar with it. So thank you so much for educating our Louisiana healthcare professionals on this topic. So as a reminder to all our attendees, we will be sending out an email about 1 week after with information on how to get your certificates. And we will be sending out a version of the PowerPoint in PDF form to everyone as well. So be on the lookout for that. And then in the future, for future presentations, please visit foundationforwellness.com/DTx. You can register for the upcoming webinars on that. Thank you, Dr. Alouf. Thank you, Dr. Parks, for being with us today. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.